The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Thomas Harrison adjusted his red tunic for the last time. 23 years he had served the crown, 23 years of unwavering loyalty and perfect protocol. His boots clicked against the marble floors as he made his way to the main entrance, where tourists would soon gather to witness the changing of the guard. Thomas had seen 3 monarchs during his service. He remembered the day Queen Elizabeth passed away, how the entire palace fell silent except for the sound of grown men weeping. He had stood at attention for 16 hours straight that day, tears streaming down his face beneath his bearskin hat. The Queen had been more than a monarch to him. She had been the embodiment of everything he believed in. The transition to King Charles had been smooth enough. Thomas respected the new king, though he missed the Queen's gentle presence. But today was different. Today, for the first time since the coronation, Queen Camilla would be making an official appearance at the palace, and Thomas would be expected to perform the traditional acknowledgement. As he took his position by the main gate, Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle. The morning briefing had been clear. When Queen Camilla passed, he was to present arms and bow his head in respect. It was protocol. It was his duty. It was what 23 years of service had trained him to do without question. But something deep inside Thomas rebelled against the idea. He had served under Queen Elizabeth when Camilla was still the other woman, when the royal family was torn apart by scandal and divorce. He remembered the pain in Princess Diana's eyes during those final public appearances, the way she had always taken time to speak with the guards, asking about their families and remembering their names. The tourists began to gather, cameras ready to capture the pageantry of royal protocol. Thomas stood straighter, his mind racing. He thought about his grandfather, who had also served as a palace guard and had taught him that loyalty was not just about following orders, but about standing up for what was right. The palace doors opened, and Thomas could see the royal party approaching. His heart pounded so hard he was sure the tourists could hear it. In moments he would face a choice that would define not just his career, but his entire sense of honor and duty. As the group drew closer, Thomas could make out Queen Camilla's figure among the entourage. She wore an elegant blue coat and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had finally achieved the position she had long sought. The other guards had already begun their preparations for the formal acknowledgement. Thomas's mind flashed to his oath of service, to the promises he had made to serve the crown faithfully. But it also flashed to the memory of Queen Elizabeth's funeral, to the promises he had made to himself about what true loyalty meant. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly, and Thomas Harrison knew that whatever choice he made in the next few minutes would change everything. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Thomas could feel the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. 23 years of perfect service, 23 years of never questioning an order, were about to come to an end. He took a deep breath and made his choice. Queen Camilla approached with her entourage, her smile confident as she waved to the gathering crowd of tourists. The morning sun caught the diamonds in her brooch, a gift from King Charles that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. The irony was not lost on Thomas Harrison as he watched her approach his post. The other guards had already begun their ceremonial movements. Thomas could see his colleague, Corporal Williams, preparing to present arms. Williams was younger, only 5 years in service, and had no memory of the troubled times that haunted Thomas's conscience. To Williams, this was simply another day of royal protocol. As Queen Camilla drew within 20 feet of his position, Thomas felt time slow down. The protocol was clear and automatic. He should be raising his rifle to present arms, should be preparing to bow his head in acknowledgement of her royal status. His muscles tensed, but instead of following the familiar motions he had performed thousands of times, Thomas remained perfectly still. The tourists began to murmur as they noticed something was wrong. One guard was not moving with the others. Queen Camilla's eyes met Thomas's for a brief moment, and he saw a flicker of confusion cross her face. She had expected the familiar choreography of royal deference, the seamless display of loyalty that had been performed for centuries. But Thomas stood frozen, his rifle at his side, his eyes looking straight ahead rather than acknowledging her presence. It was a small act of defiance that spoke volumes. In the world of royal protocol, where every gesture carried meaning. His stillness was as loud as a shout. The Queen's private secretary, walking slightly behind her, noticed the irregularity immediately. His trained eye caught every detail of royal protocol, and he could see that Sergeant Harrison was not following procedure. He made a mental note to address this later, though he assumed it was simply a momentary lapse in concentration. Thomas could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. The tourists sensed drama, but didn't understand its significance. His fellow guards continued their duties, but he could sense their confusion. In 23 years, Thomas had never broken protocol, never given anyone reason to question his dedication or professionalism. Queen Camilla passed by his position, and Thomas felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over him. He had done it. He had refused to acknowledge her as his queen. But as the reality of his actions sank in, he realized there would be consequences. The royal household did not tolerate breaches of protocol, especially not public ones with tourists watching and cameras recording. His commanding officer, Major Peterson, had been watching from across the courtyard. Thomas could see him approaching with quick, determined steps. Peterson was a fair man, but a strict one, someone who had worked his way up through the ranks and understood the importance of discipline and order. The tourists were beginning to disperse, many of them unaware that they had witnessed something extraordinary, but Thomas knew that word would spread quickly through the palace. By evening, everyone from the kitchen staff to the king himself would know that Sergeant Thomas Harrison had refused to acknowledge Queen Camilla. As Major Peterson drew closer, Thomas prepared himself for what was to come. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. His 23 years of perfect service were about to be overshadowed by one moment of conscience, one decision that would define the rest of his life. The confrontation was inevitable, and Thomas Harrison stood ready to defend his actions, knowing that some principles were worth more than protocol. Major Peterson's face was a mask of controlled anger as he approached Thomas. The tourists had mostly departed, but a few stragglers remained, sensing that something important was happening. Peterson waited until they were out of earshot before speaking, his voice low and sharp. "Sergeant Harrison, my office. Now." The words cut through the morning air like a blade. Thomas nodded once and followed his commanding officer across the courtyard, his boots echoing against the ancient stones. Other guards watched from their positions, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes full of questions. The walk to Peterson's office felt like a march to execution. Thomas had been in this office many times over the years, usually for commendations or routine discussions. The walls were lined with photographs of past ceremonies, royal weddings, state dinners, and changing of the guard ceremonies. Every image represented the traditions that Thomas had just broken. Peterson closed the door behind them and moved to his desk without sitting down. He stood with his hands pressed flat against the wooden surface, his knuckles white with tension. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. 23 years, Harrison," Peterson finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. 23 years of exemplary service. I've watched you train new recruits, seen you stand in the rain for hours without complaint, witnessed your dedication to this institution. And now this." Thomas stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point just above Peterson's head. "Yes, sir," he replied simply. He could have offered excuses, could have claimed illness or momentary confusion, but he chose honesty instead. "Do you understand what you've done?" Peterson continued, his voice rising slightly. "Queen Camilla's private secretary has already contacted me. There were tourists with cameras, Harrison. Social media posts are probably being uploaded as we speak. This isn't just a private matter anymore." The reality of the situation began to sink in. Thomas had acted on principle, but he hadn't fully considered the modern implications. In an age where every royal moment was documented and shared instantly across the globe, his small act of defiance could become an international incident. "The Queen herself will likely hear about this within the hour," Peterson said, beginning to pace behind his desk. "And then it goes to the king. Do you understand the position you've put all of us in? The entire guard is now under scrutiny because of your actions." Thomas felt a pang of guilt about involving his fellow guards in his personal protest. These were good men who had done nothing wrong, yet they would all face questions because of his choice. But even knowing this, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. "I understand, sir," Thomas said quietly. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." Peterson stopped pacing and studied Thomas's face carefully. In all their years of working together, he had never seen this expression on the sergeant's face, a mixture of determination and peace that suggested a man who had finally acted according to his deepest beliefs. "Why, Harrison?" Peterson asked, his anger giving way to genuine confusion. "Help me understand. What could possibly be worth throwing away your career, your pension, your reputation?" For the first time since entering the office, Thomas met his commanding officer's eyes directly. "Some things are more important than career, sir. Sometimes a man has to take a stand even if he stands alone." The answer hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Peterson had been a soldier long enough to recognize genuine conviction when he saw it, even if he disagreed with the choice that conviction had inspired. The news spread through Buckingham Palace like wildfire. Kitchen staff whispered about it over lunch preparation. Housekeepers discussed it while changing bed linens, and security personnel debated its implications during shift changes. By noon, even the most junior members of the royal household had heard about Sergeant Harrison's unprecedented breach of protocol. In the royal apartments, Queen Camilla sat in her private sitting room, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. Her private secretary, Robert Fitzwilliam, had briefed her on the incident with characteristic diplomatic language. But the message was clear. One of the palace guards had publicly refused to acknowledge her authority. It was quite deliberate. "Your Majesty," Fitzwilliam explained, consulting his notes. "Sergeant Harrison has an exemplary record spanning over 2 decades. This was not a mistake or momentary lapse. According to witnesses, he looked directly at you and chose not to follow protocol." Queen Camilla gazed out the window at the palace gardens, where tourists continued their daily pilgrimage to catch glimpses of royal life. She had spent years preparing for this role, enduring public criticism and private doubt. Just when she thought she had finally earned her place, this incident threatened to undermine her authority. "What do we know about this Sergeant Harrison?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Fitzwilliam flipped through his file. Thomas Harrison, age 45, served under Queen Elizabeth for most of his career. Decorated twice for exceptional service. No disciplinary issues on his record. Married with 2 children, both in university. His father was also a palace guard, and his grandfather before that. The generational loyalty made the betrayal sting even more. This wasn't a young radical making a political statement. This was a man whose family had served the crown for generations, and he had chosen to break that tradition. Meanwhile, in the guards' quarters, Thomas sat alone in the break room staring at his phone. The story had indeed made it to social media, just as Peterson had predicted. Blurry photos of him standing motionless while other guards' presented arms were being shared with captions like, "Palace Guard refuses to bow to Queen Camilla," and "Royal E. Protocol broken in dramatic fashion." His wife Sarah had already called twice, having seen the news online. Their conversation had been difficult. She understood his principles but worried about their future. With 2 children in university and a mortgage to pay, Thomas's pension and benefits were crucial to their family's stability. Corporal Williams approached cautiously, unsure how to navigate this unprecedented situation. Thomas had been his mentor when he first joined the Guard, teaching him everything from proper posture to handling difficult tourists. The younger man felt torn between loyalty to his teacher and loyalty to the institution they both served. "Sarge," Williams said quietly, taking a seat across from Thomas. "People are asking questions. The other lads don't know what to think." Thomas looked up from his phone, seeing the concern in Williams's young face. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you've lost your mind, whether you're making some kind of political statement, whether this is about Princess Diana." Williams paused, then added more quietly, "Whether they should follow your example." The weight of influence hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had acted according to his own conscience, but he hadn't considered that others might see his choice as a call to action. The last thing he wanted was to inspire other guards to risk their careers based on his personal decision. "Listen to me carefully," Thomas said, leaning forward. "This was my choice based on my own beliefs and experiences. Each man has to decide for himself what he can live with. Don't let my actions influence your career or your conscience." But even as he spoke these words, Thomas could see that the damage was already done. His singular act of defiance had created ripples that were spreading throughout the entire royal household. forcing everyone to examine their own loyalties and beliefs in ways they never had before. By evening, the story had reached the highest levels of the royal household. King Charles sat in his private study, the day's newspapers spread across his mahogany desk. The headlines were sensational. Palace guards royal snub and protocol rebellion at Buckingham Palace. Accompanying photos showed Thomas standing rigidly while other guards honored Queen Camilla, the king's private secretary. Sir Geoffrey Morrison stood nearby with a thick folder of documents. "Your Majesty, this situation requires immediate attention. The press is beginning to speculate about internal divisions within the royal household. Some are already drawing parallels to historical controversies." King Charles rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of royal responsibility. Every action taken by the monarchy was scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted by millions of people. A single guard's moment of conscience had become a public relations crisis that could undermine his wife's position and his own authority. "What are my options, Geoffrey?" the king asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Traditionally, such a breach of protocol would result in immediate dismissal, Morrison replied carefully. However, given Sergeant Harrison's exemplary record and the potential for martyrdom, we might consider alternative approaches. The irony was not lost on Charles. As Prince of Wales, he had often chafed against rigid protocol himself. He understood the burden of following rules that sometimes seemed to conflict with personal beliefs. Yet as king, he was now responsible for upholding those same traditions. Meanwhile, Thomas sat at his kitchen table at home, helping his daughter Emma with her university coursework. The normalcy of family life felt surreal after the day's events. His son Michael had called from Edinburgh, where he was studying law, wanting to understand the legal implications of his father's actions. "Dad?" Emma said quietly, looking up from her textbook. "Mum showed me the news articles. Are you really going to lose your job?" Thomas set down his pen and studied his daughter's worried face. At 19, she was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but young enough to still believe that doing the right thing always led to good outcomes. "I might," he admitted honestly. "But sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. I chose to follow my conscience, and I have to accept whatever consequences come from that." Sarah Harrison stood in the doorway, having listened to the conversation. After 22 years of marriage, she knew her husband well enough to understand that his decision hadn't been impulsive. But she also knew the practical realities they now faced. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," she told Thomas. "Reporters, old friends from the regiment, even some people claiming to support what you did. Mrs. Fletcher from down the street says her grandfather would have been proud." That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Harrison home. Major Peterson stood on their doorstep, out of uniform and looking uncomfortable. Sarah showed him into the living room where Thomas waited with obvious tension. "I'm not here officially," Peterson began, sitting heavily in their worn armchair. "I'm here as someone who's known you for 15 years and respects what you've contributed to the Guard." Thomas remained silent, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "There's going to be a formal hearing tomorrow," Peterson continued. "The king himself has requested a full report. But before that happens, I need to ask you one more time. Is there any way you can explain this that doesn't end with your dismissal?" The question hung in the air between them. Peterson was offering Thomas a lifeline, a chance to craft an explanation that might save his career. All he had to do was claim temporary confusion, stress, or illness. A simple apology and promise not to repeat the behavior might be enough. But as Thomas looked around his modest living room, at the photographs of his family and the medals from his years of service, he realized that saving his career would mean betraying everything he had stood for that morning. The formal hearing took place in a wood-paneled room deep within Buckingham Palace, far from the public areas where tourists gathered. Thomas entered wearing his dress uniform, every medal and ribbon precisely positioned according to regulations he had followed faithfully for 23 years. The irony of wearing symbols of royal service while facing charges of disloyalty was not lost on him. A panel of 3 senior officers sat behind a polished table, their faces grave and professional. Major Peterson was present as a witness, along with Queen Camilla's private secretary and a representative from the royal household. The proceedings had all the formality of a military court-martial, though technically this was an internal disciplinary hearing. Colonel Margaret Thornfield, The most senior officer present read the charges with crisp precision. Sergeant Harrison, you are accused of willful breach of royal protocol, failure to follow lawful orders, and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. How do you plead? Thomas stood at attention, his voice steady and clear. Guilty as charged, ma'am. A murmur ran through the room. Most disciplinary hearings involve denials, excuses, or attempts to minimize culpability. Thomas's straightforward admission caught everyone off guard. Colonel Thornfield studied him carefully. Sergeant Harrison, given your exemplary record, this panel is prepared to consider mitigating circumstances. Would you care to explain your actions? This was the moment Thomas had anticipated all night. He could offer the explanations that Major Peterson had hinted at: stress, momentary confusion, personal problems. Instead, he chose a different path. Ma'am, I served Queen Elizabeth for 19 years. During that time, I witnessed events that challenged my personal beliefs about duty and honor. When I was ordered to acknowledge Queen Camilla yesterday, I found that my conscience would not permit me to do so. I understand this puts me in violation of protocol, and I accept full responsibility. The room fell silent. Robert Fitzwilliam, Queen Camilla's private secretary, leaned forward. Sergeant Harrison, are you saying you refuse to acknowledge Her Majesty's legitimate authority? Thomas chose his words carefully. I am saying that my oath was to serve the crown with honor and integrity. Yesterday, I believed that following orders would compromise my personal integrity. I chose integrity over obedience. Colonel Thornfield made notes on her tablet, her expression unreadable. Sergeant Harrison, you understand that personal feelings cannot supersede military discipline? The entire system depends on orders being followed regardless of individual opinion. Yes, ma'am. I understand that completely. I also understand that some decisions transcend career considerations. The questioning continued for another hour, with each panel member probing different aspects of Thomas's decision. They asked about his mental health, his family situation, his political beliefs, and his understanding of the consequences. Throughout it all, Thomas remained calm and honest, never wavering from his position. Finally, Colonel Thornfield called for a recess. Sergeant Harrison, you will wait outside while this panel deliberates. Given the unusual nature of this case, we may need to consult with higher authorities before reaching a decision. As Thomas waited in the corridor, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his wife that morning. Sarah had finally said what they both knew, that she was proud of him for standing up for his beliefs, even if it cost them everything. When the panel reconvened an hour later, Colonel Thornfield's expression was somber. Sergeant Harrison, this panel has reached a decision regarding your case. However, before we announce our ruling, we have been informed that His Majesty the King wishes to speak with you personally. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. In all the years of palace protocol hearings, no one could remember the monarch personally intervening in a disciplinary matter involving a single guard. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he realized that his small act of conscience had somehow reached the very pinnacle of the institution he had served so faithfully. King Charles received Thomas in his private study, the same room where he had wrestled with the implications of the incident just 24 hours earlier. The king sat behind his desk while Thomas stood at attention, uncertain of the protocol for such an unprecedented meeting. Please, sit down, Sergeant Harrison, the king said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. This is not a formal audience. I simply wanted to understand your perspective before any final decisions are made. Thomas sat carefully, still maintaining his military bearing despite the informal invitation. The room was filled with personal photographs, paintings, and books that revealed glimpses of the man behind the crown. He noticed a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth among the personal items. I've read the transcript of your hearing, King Charles began, his voice thoughtful. Your honesty is refreshing, if somewhat troubling. In my position, I rarely encounter people who speak without calculation or political motive. The king stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where tourists continued their daily pilgrimage. You know, Sergeant Harrison, I have some understanding of the conflict between duty and conscience. There were many years when I had to follow protocols that I personally questioned. Thomas remained silent, unsure whether a response was expected or appropriate. King Charles turned back to face him. Tell me, what did you think would happen when you made your choice yesterday morning? Your Majesty, I honestly didn't think beyond that moment, Thomas admitted. I simply knew that I couldn't perform an action that violated my deepest beliefs about loyalty and honor. And those beliefs center on your service to my mother? Yes, sir. Queen Elizabeth embodied everything I believed the monarchy should represent. When I took my oath, it was to serve her and what she stood for. The king nodded slowly. I understand that sentiment more than you might imagine. My mother was an extraordinary woman who inspired tremendous loyalty. But surely you recognize that the institution she represented must continue beyond her personal reign. Thomas struggled with how to answer honestly without causing further offense. Your Majesty, I recognize the legal and constitutional reality of the succession, but I found that my personal honor would not allow me to extend the same reverence to Queen Camilla that I gave to Queen Elizabeth. The admission hung in the air between them. King Charles had spent years defending his wife against public criticism and private doubt. Yet here was a man whose loyalty to the crown was unquestionable, but whose conscience would not permit him to accept Camilla as his queen. Sergeant Harrison, do you understand that your actions have created a significant problem, not just for you personally, but for the institution of the monarchy? I do, Your Majesty, and I deeply regret any embarrassment or difficulty I've caused. That was never my intention. King Charles returned to his desk and picked up a folder containing Thomas's service record. 23 years of exemplary service. Commendations for bravery, leadership, and dedication. Your commanding officers describe you as one of the finest guards they've ever supervised. The king closed the folder and looked directly at Thomas. I'm going to make you an offer, Sergeant Harrison. You may retire with full honors and pension, effective immediately. Your service record will reflect only your years of distinguished duty. In exchange, you will make no public statements about this incident and will avoid any media contact. Thomas felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. The offer was more generous than he had any right to expect, but it also meant the end of a career that had defined his adult life. There is one condition, the king continued. I want you to understand why I'm making this offer. It's not because I agree with your position or approve of your actions. It's because I believe that a man who acts according to his conscience, even when it costs him everything, deserves respect. Thomas stood and bowed formally. Your Majesty, I accept your offer with gratitude, and I want you to know that my respect for the crown as an institution remains unchanged, even if my personal feelings about specific individuals may differ. 3 months later, Thomas Harrison began working as a security consultant for a private firm. He never spoke publicly about his final day as a palace guard, but word spread quietly through veteran military circles about the man who chose conscience over career. His story became a whispered legend among those who understood that true honor sometimes requires the courage to stand alone. Queen Camilla never publicly acknowledged the incident, but those close to her noticed that she always seemed slightly more tentative during palace ceremonies, as if remembering that respect must be earned rather than simply expected. And King Charles, despite the complications the incident had caused, found himself oddly comforted by the knowledge that there were still people in the world who would sacrifice everything for their principles.